And today I'm very glad to present Professor Matthew Kam. He's an assistant professor at the Carnegie Mellon University. He has a very combined and multidisciplinary background in computer sciences and as well in economics and in education. So I think he's going to bring us a very nice presentation on some issues that we have already talked here yesterday, because he's going to talk about language learning, an issue that yesterday arose, as well as on gaming on cell phones, just to reach this kind of learn. But now we are moving a little bit the context, and we are going to a rural context in developing areas. So I think that this is going to bring us a new focus and new evidence on what can be done with these handheld devices in this context. So please, Professor Kam, go on. You've got, as you know, half an hour for the presentation, and then we hope for your comments.
Okay, great. Okay, I hope the mic is working.
Hi, testing. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks so much for the great introduction, and I want to first start by thanking everybody in the audience for waking up in time for my talk, especially given that we've had a very eventful night last night that I also greatly appreciate in terms of the hospitality from the conference organizers. So my name is Matthew Kam, and I'm from this department that's called the Human-Computer Interaction Institute. So basically, well, we are actually the first department in North America to offer degree-granting programs at both the PhD and master's level for human-computer interaction. We've just celebrated the 14th anniversary for our degree programs just earlier this year. And in this talk, I hope that I can actually introduce and give you a flavor of some of the approaches in human-computer interaction that we actually use to help us do our interactive design and our intervention design in such a way that we hope to actually have captured some of the nuances in designing applications with and for stakeholders in local developing countries in a way that actually is as culturally appropriate as possible. Okay, so in a nutshell, well, I'm basically very honored today to have this opportunity to be talking about the Mealy project. So I'm representing the rest of my team here. And okay, so basically, in a nutshell, the project that we do is actually about looking at how we can actually develop language learning games running on cell phones, which I'm happy to demo anytime after this. Okay, so I have a demo here. So the aim of the project really is to look at how we can develop games, educational games that actually improve literacy skills that children in developing countries can use anywhere, anytime to acquire literacy skills. And these are just some of the background of the other team members that I work with that I'm pretty honored to actually have on my team. So one of the important things of doing educational games is that this is inherently multidisciplinary, and we need to combine a lot of different expertise together. So you see that down here we actually combine some of the different departments in Carnegie Mellon that have different kinds of strengths, such as video game design, because we need to get the games part to be effective in terms of being engaging for learners. And also the people from the the modern languages department, who are actually specialists in how language acquisition and reading literacy actually take place. So we try to combine very different disciplines to really attack this kind of real-world problems. So in addition to all the great collaborators that I have at Carnegie Mellon, so this is an idea of who are some of the international collaborators that we work with. And you'll find that we have a pretty long list in India, because that's actually where we've been working for the last 6.5 years. So we've also had new partners coming up, joining us in China and in Nairobi, so that's Kenya. And most of these international expansions are really done by our academic partners in those countries who are very excited by the kinds of results that we've been getting. And I just told them, if you are interested in taking what we've done, just take our research results and run with it and see what you can do with it, because we have our results that's published that people can use. Okay. Yeah, and the last thing that I want to mention about my team members is that we don't just work with students in Carnegie Mellon University and in North America, but we actually make it a point to work a lot with local universities in the host countries that we work in. And part of that reason is that it is actually very important for us to be building local capacity, getting local students involved, partly because they have a knowledge of the local language and the local context, local systems. So they help us a lot when we actually have to get our systems deployed, because they accompany us as our field researchers, as our interpreters, in terms of doing data collection and also piloting the prototypes, and also actually getting involved with the actual development process of engineering the systems. So we benefit a lot from actually working with local undergraduates, and that's, I think, one of the strong points that we have in trying to do local capacity building, so that when they get involved in our projects, they also get a sense of what it's actually like to be getting involved in human-computer interaction, which is a fairly new discipline that isn't something you see a lot in some places, where in India, for example, a lot of the higher education still focuses on traditional engineering, and we want to actually expose them to some of these broader and newer areas that hopefully students would actually want to pursue as their career once they think about going for graduate programs. Okay, so let me start by jumping into the project description. So one of the important needs, as you've probably heard from yesterday's talks over and over again, is that English as a second language is very important. So down here in this project, even though we actually do literacy, right now the current focus is on English as a second language, because English is the so-called international language of business. So basically in a country like India, for example, English competency is really that important skill that helps to open a lot of doors to economic opportunities. Because when we talk about kids who actually grow up in village areas, well, one of the challenges is that a lot of these kids, well, they have parents who are actually very supportive about them picking up English literacy, because their parents know that this is what it takes to actually get them the means to get a good, high-paying job. But the problem is that even though parents, even in the rural areas, put political pressure on local governments to make English a mandatory part of the school curriculum. So the problem is that, well, public schools run by governments, especially in rural areas, don't actually succeed very well. There's a lot of different reasons for that. One reason is that the teachers who need to teach English themselves cannot speak the language when we have to communicate with them. Yeah, we do it through interpreters. Well, there are other problems too. So for example, teacher absenteeism is very high in India. On average, 1 out of every 4 teachers is actually absent from work on any day. For various reasons we don't want to get into. Okay, so one of the challenges that we've realized is that it's really very difficult to make an impact through the formal schooling system when teachers feel that they are underpaid. Teacher qualification is an issue. But I think the biggest and most significant barrier to formal schooling in some of these developing regions, like India, for example. So in rural India, which is where the project focuses on right now, more than 43% of school-aged children in the rural areas don't actually go to school regularly. Okay, and that's because they actually have to help out in agricultural work, or they have to be doing housework. And all those kinds of child labor commitments actually make it difficult for them to go to school regularly, because they have to be making income to actually help generate income for the rest of the family. So you see that, based on UNESCO statistics and UNICEF statistics, so the bulk of out-of-school children actually come from South Asia as well as Sub-Saharan Africa. Yeah, and these are just statistics only for children who don't actually go to school at all. But there are also kids who go to school but not that regularly. So that really is what we see as the huge problem in terms of access to education. So given that it is really difficult to use formal schooling as the primary approach to actually improve access to education in some of these developing regions. So what we are trying to do in this project is actually to look at how we can use technology to make education more accessible in places and times that are actually more convenient than schools, so that children, for example, who actually have access to cell phones in some of these developing countries could actually use that as a vehicle to get access to educational content. So we see that, well, I mean, we all know that there's increasing cell phone penetration in developing countries. And I think what's really amazing is that, there's a huge increase in cell phone ownership in developing countries compared to some of these industrialized countries. So what we really see is that cell phones actually seem to be the most promising technology platform that these guys would actually have. And in fact, the cell phone is probably the first smart technology device that they would actually have. Not a desktop computer, not a laptop. Okay, so basically the whole idea behind this project in a nutshell is that, is there a way that we can actually develop high quality educational experiences, especially in the form of games that are highly engaging, and make it accessible on cell phones that children would actually have so that they can access some of these educational resources if they can't actually go to school that often. Okay, so the project has already been around since 2004. Obviously, I can't really go into all the different stages that we have gone through. So what we're going to focus on today is really some of the key results from the last two studies. But I thought this would be a nice timeline to just give you a sense of the many different stages that the project has actually gone through. Because when we first started the project in 2004, needs assessment, at that time we really didn't know what was the right thing to be doing this project. And all we really knew was that, well, we didn't want to come in with any preconceived idea about what the locals would actually need. I mean, it's not appropriate for us to be telling them that. So we just really spent time on the ground talking to stakeholders, visiting various low-income schools in the villages and in the urban slums, just to get a sense of what the kinds of ground-level conditions are like, what are the kinds of educational opportunities that they really want to have, but they see themselves as having difficulty in getting access to. And that was when we get a sense from talking to them that English literacy is one of those things they really wanted to acquire, but for all these various reasons, they just always struggle to pick that up. So with that kind of background information, so that was how we got into doing various exploratory studies. And at that stage, we still didn't have a clue about what we were going to do other than knowing that we want to do something. And we experimented with a lot of ideas for computer-aided learning. Okay, and most of them didn't work. So that was how we tried all kinds of ideas at a small scale, find that it didn't work. But that was useful in just giving us a better sense of why certain approaches just cannot work. And eventually, when we got to the stage, it was only 1.5 years later, okay, into the project that we actually hit on the idea of using mobile learning as one potential way. And I think anybody who knows me well enough would know that even though my PhD is in computer science, I'm actually a big skeptic of technology. So that was why I wanted to check and see if this would even work. So we did some of these very small-scale pilots to see if it worked. So we've done many rounds of pilots, beginning with feasibility pilots, just using mobile learning to try some very small ideas for language learning. We did a lot of field testing and improvements to the earlier prototypes that we had. And eventually, it was only really in 2008 that we really started the summative assessments to really evaluate if some of the prototypes that we've had would actually work and why. So this is really the focus I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this presentation. Okay, and of course, we've had the project featured on television and in the press in the last couple of years. So anybody who's really interested in seeing how the project works on the ground, I just invite you to go to these URLs. You get to see the videos of how the project actually works at the ground level. Okay, so this was one of the classroom studies that we did in 2008. So that was the first time that we actually did a semester-long pilot evaluation of the educational games that we've had on the cell phones. So the goal was, of course, to check if children would actually learn anything using these kinds of technologies. So the way that it worked was that this pilot took the form of an after-school program. So this is actually a village school that was owned and run by. This is a private school, okay? It's not a government school, so you see that it's pretty well equipped. This was actually owned and operated by one of our non-government organization partners in India. And so what we did was that we actually made use of the premises to run an after-school program where we actually made this available to any children who's actually living in the nearby villages. And we just said, okay, down here we are going to be running an after-school program 3 times every week in the afternoon. And you guys in the villages, you're welcome to come during this period for 2 hours in the afternoon to get access to the educational games on the cell phones that we are piloting. And And this whole pilot lasted one entire semester. So the goal really was for us to check if the kids were actually learning anything. So we did a pre-test before the intervention. We did a post-test again at the end of it. And of course, we see that in terms of the post-test improvements, well, we actually saw very nice results in the sense that, well, there were 27 kids who actually participated in this program from the villages. And we saw that they actually had so-called significant gains on spelling skills as measured by the post-test. And this was actually something that we thought was very promising, given the fact that spelling skills was actually one of the things that they struggled with. So what I mean by that was that when we first did our baseline assessments before the pilot started, so one of the things we realized was that the kids, on average, participants in this program would actually have about 5 years of English as a second language classes in their government school before they took part in this. But the problem is that even though they had 5 years of classes, well, they were actually struggling to write their names correctly in English on the test papers that we handed out. So it's kind of amazing actually considering that, you know, they were actually able to improve on their spelling skills and to spell the words that we had been teaching them after a semester period when they still struggled to actually spell their names correctly in English. Okay, so we have a classroom pilot that actually demonstrated so-called learning gains in a classroom environment. But I think what is really more important in terms of mobile learning, because the whole idea behind mobile learning, and I think the great potential behind mobile learning, it's not just that it actually delivers learning benefits, but the fact that children can actually learn anywhere, anytime. So that's a more important part. So the question for us really is that, well, would the same children in similar demographic background actually voluntarily take out the cell phones if they have it and use it to learn English, you know, during their own free time? Okay, so if you don't actually have adults around, say adults facilitators in an after-school program or adult teachers who are around to force the kids to take out the technology to learn, well, would they actually do it on their own free will? So that was actually the point of doing an out-of-school study for us to actually get a sense of what are the kinds of out-of-school behaviors and that children actually do with the technology when they have access to that. So this was a paper that you guys can look at if you are more interested in the detailed results. So that's published in ACM CHI, which is the most competitive venue for publishing research in human-computer interaction. Okay, so just a quick background. So these are some of the participants' background. If you can look at this, well, you can see that we have 18 participants who took part in this study over one entire semester also. This continued after the classroom study. So we find that, you know, well, our participants fall into two different villages. We also organize them visually on this representation in terms of different castes. So you see the lower caste children and the upper caste children. So these are the upper caste children who are called the Brahmins, you know, or what we call the priestly caste. We have boys and girls also. And the lines represent the existing relationships, as in this guy knows this guy at the start of the program. Okay, so that's what this means. I'll come back to this again at the end. Okay, so one of the things that was really important for us was, well, you know, if you're trying to actually so-called design mobile learning experiences, well, the technology doesn't really take place in a vacuum outside of the social context. And I think what's really important is that we need to really understand what are the kinds of, the kind of social environment that the children actually live in. Which means that, okay, well, we need to try to understand what goes on in the day of a life of a typical rural kid. From the time they wake up in the early morning till the time that they actually go to sleep. So this was the kinds of data that we were actually collecting by actually following the children around. So we get a sense of what actually goes on in their everyday lives. And the goal really was for us to identify the different scenarios in those everyday moments that would be very good opportunities to actually embed learning, mobile learning episodes into. So we're trying to use technology to augment those kinds of existing moments in which mobile learning seems to be a feasible intervention to introduce into those times. So in total, we actually came up with 9 of those different scenarios, just based on those results. So I'm just going to talk about 2 of them here. And one thing to note about these scenarios is that there's a lot of that kind of distinctions between the scenarios in terms of the participants, whether or not they are boys or girls, or they are upper caste or lower caste. You have all those kinds of social fault lines that actually influence a lot about what actually goes on. So for example, when we talk about this, so this is one scenario in which, it's something that seems plausible in the morning when kids are actually working in the fields. And then when they're working in the field, they might have a break time, so they're sitting down to take a rest. And what we thought was that instead of having everybody take a rest there and you looking at me and I'm looking at you, well, why don't the kids actually take out a game that they can be playing to learn English during those break times, which is something that you can do once you have technology. And we found that, okay, so on paper, this idea looks great, but in practice, well, the way that caste actually comes into this whole equation also affects it, because we noticed that a lot of these children who come from upper caste backgrounds, when they tell us that they have to work in the field, they're not really the guys who are doing all the hard labor, okay? Well, the guys from the upper caste, well, their families actually own the fields. Okay, so when they say that they have to work in the fields, they're actually supervising the lower caste children who are working. And the lower caste children are really the guys who are employed as daily wage laborers to be working, doing the hard work. So what this really means is that for the upper caste children, well, this scenario is very, very plausible for them, and they actually took out the cell phones and they're learning under the comfort of a tent. Well, lower caste children, well, in comparison, they have time to learn, but not during this time when they have to be working, maybe during other times. So the amounts of time and access to mobile learning opportunities actually vary a lot also based on the gender and the caste that you belong to. So these were some of the things that we found out. And I just want to talk a bit about the design methodology that went into our games before I talk a bit about some of our results. Okay, so briefly speaking, well, we had games that target English vocabulary words. So this curriculum is actually developed by a local teacher because it has to target local language learning needs. One simple way of looking at this is that you have a game that uses a native language to explain some of these words like father, and you have a screen after that that actually tests the kid to check if he actually remembers that word. Okay, so that's the teaching part that doesn't use us games. I'm talking about the games next. So I'm not going to go too much into these details, but I just want to point out that we actually try to draw on as much of the research on second language learning as much as possible, because there's really a lot of education research in reading literacy that we should actually be drawing on. And this really is a project on education. It's not a technology project. So that's why we actually started by getting a sense of what is the education theory and education research, and what does it have to tell us about improving learning for literacy. So the challenge is that even though I've just showed you some of those, a quick overview of some of the so-called pedagogical approaches that's substantiated in the literature on language learning, but the real challenge is that it's very hard to actually operationalize those kinds of theories into practice when we are doing instructional design for technology. Another reason is that, well, we don't really want to reinvent the wheel. So there's a lot of existing educational products out there on the market for language learning. So one of the things that was very important for us in terms of our design methodology was not to reinvent the wheel. And instead, we actually looked at slightly more than 35 of these commercial applications out there. Not so much that we want to just copy what these guys do, but we were trying to capture some of the best practices in language teaching that were employed in these applications. So we made use of all those theoretical concepts from research and used that as a way to help us to analyze existing products, which we then actually took out some of these best practices in the form of patterns. So patterns is a way to capture all these experiences. And then those patterns actually became a kind of a design knowledge that we actually draw on to design some of the games. So not so much to say that the patterns themselves are perfect, but it's just a way for us to capture a lot of these so-called starting points that we can use as a starting point for instructional design. And then if there's anything that's not good about it that we need to fix, well, that at least provides a basis for us to figure out what needs to be improved on, rather than having to reinvent what a lot of commercial developers have already done. So another thing that we found also was that, so I just finished talking a lot about the so-called instructional design part of the project. But there's also the video game design part of it, which is also quite complicated. And one of the challenges is that when we first designed some early prototypes for pilot testing, well, those games were just not making sense to the village children because they played very different games. You know, if you look at the kinds of games that they play, indoor games and their playground games, well, their games are so different from the kinds of Western video games that we are playing every day and we are familiar with. So the earlier games that we designed for them, well, the kids just didn't make sense of it. So what we eventually did was we actually went back to study 28 of those games that they play every day. And we tried to learn from their games. And we did a cross-cultural study of not only the elements that go into their game rules and their game mechanics, but also a cross-cultural analysis of how their games are actually different from the kinds of Western video games that we're familiar with. And as a result of this analysis, we actually have a list of guidelines in terms of what are those kinds of differences in the rules and in the elements that comprise their games that they are familiar with, so that we actually drew on these kinds of guidelines subsequently in our design processes. And by taking some of these differences into account, we were actually able to design games that are closer towards the kinds of intuition and understanding that village children actually have about games. Okay, yeah, so this is just an example of one of their playground game, and this is one of the video games that we designed based on that. So you see that this was a game that the kids had to climb up the tree and they had to go pick up one of those stakes. So you had to run down from a tree, pick up a stake, and run back up to the tree before somebody catches you. So we essentially copied some of these elements from their rules so that we could actually design games that are more intuitive for them. Okay, so there's a lot of findings. I'm not going to talk too much about them because I think I'm running out of time. So I'll just try to summarize some of the key points. So one of them is that, yes, electricity was a huge problem, but it's actually more complicated than just saying that. Because for any of us from a Western context who go into a village, we tend to think that a village is very homogeneous, but it's not. There are actually, well, at least even by a gross oversimplification, we actually realize that the kids coming from our villages actually fall into at least three broad different levels of socioeconomic strata. So the guys who are on the highest end, well, they were very well-to-do. They had power generators at home, so they have access to electricity anytime, whenever they need it by turning on the generators. Well, the kids who were in the lower two economic tiers were the guys who actually had less access to electricity. So the ones in the middle, well, they have electricity, but the problem is that it comes on intermittently. You never quite know when it's going to come, when it's never going to come. For the kids who are at the bottommost, poorest level, well, it was much worse than that. And what really happened was that they had electricity, they had a lot of voltage fluctuation. So this actually fried the battery chargers that we provided them with. And the battery chargers got fried again and again. We kept giving them replacements until we got tired of giving them replacements. But the nice thing was that even though they couldn't really recharge their batteries using their battery chargers because it kept getting fried, they were actually very resourceful in getting electricity from elsewhere, like, you know, borrowing, like getting a neighbor who has better quality electricity to charge their cell phones for them, or they would actually be going to their workplaces which have electricity, you know, and borrow electricity from their employers to recharge their cell phones. So they do actually come up with a lot of different ways of getting access to electricity. And in short, so even though electricity access was definitely one of those huge barriers to using the cell phones for mobile learning, well, on average, the good news is that, on average, the average participants had about 2 hours and 23 minutes of electricity. So they had enough electricity to actually use to play the games for 2 hours and 23 minutes per week. And that was based on the kinds of data logging that we were doing on the phones. And of course, we can see that the amounts of usage in terms of hours over the whole pilot for each of the 18 participants varied a lot based on the kinds of electricity that you have access to. Okay, so the good news was that there was some learning going on. Another maybe not so good news, but still good news is that if you could actually improve access to electricity for them, well, there would be a very high probability that they would actually be able to increase the amount, the length of usage of the games. So that's actually one of the huge bottlenecks we saw. Something else that was also, I think, important is the kinds of learning benefits that we are actually seeing, okay? Because we are still interested in what goes on in terms of learning. So this is a graph that shows the number of words covered, the week number. So in this kind of projects, well, one of the problems is that there's a lot of novelty effects when you first introduce a new technology, because kids always they always find something to be very novel when they first get it. So in the first few weeks, there was a lot of fluctuation. We didn't take those data seriously, but you can see that after week 9 and onwards, things got into a steady state. So on average, actually, when we look at what happens in a steady state, well, the average kid was covering something like 3 new vocabulary words per week. Okay, so this is the cumulative graph, the cumulative version of this. So we see that, well, in terms of week 9 and onwards, the difference in terms of total number of words covered between the start and the end was something about 46 new words. Okay, that's over 16 weeks of usage of the games in an unsupervised setting. And if you take 46 new words over 16 weeks and you extrapolate that to one entire calendar year, so that works out to something like 150 new words. So I think the big question for us when we first got this number was, is this good enough or is this not good enough? So that's something that's debatable. Well, but what we do know is that a benchmark, according to the second language learning researchers, is that, well, if you have very good learning conditions, and what learning good conditions means is that if you have very good teachers, very good classrooms that you get in an industrialized country setting, well, kids in those kinds of settings should be covering about 500 new words. So this is where, we see that we are already about slightly less than 1/3 of the way there, and getting the children to get access to some of this learning that they otherwise would not even be getting in out-of-school settings. Okay, so that's some of the results we have. Okay, I'll just skip some of these things. I'll just go on to the most interesting part. So this was one of the interesting findings that we got by the end of this pilot. So, when we were collecting the cell phones back from the children, one of the things that surprised us a lot was that 6 out of the 18 phones that we took back actually had batteries that were swollen. So, the battery eventually was twice as thick as the regular battery. And I just want to invite the audience to guess what the possible reasons might be for this battery expansion. Any guesses?
Humidity.
Sorry?
Humidity.
That's one possible reason.
High temperatures.
Yeah, high temperature, yeah. Any other guesses? So this was something that really surprised us too. And we went back to the manual for the phone, and we, not this phone, it was a different model. We went back to the manual, and the manual says, yes, the most likely reason for, battery swelling is high temperature. And can anybody guess what is the hottest part of any household? Yeah, it's a kitchen. Yeah, and then, and when we really trace it, we realized, what really was happening was that out of the 6 batteries, well, 5 out of these 6 batteries actually came from cell phones that belong to the girls. And I think that actually gave us a very close-up view of how the kinds of gender biases are actually affecting this project. So what I mean by that is that, well, when we try to introduce a technological intervention, well, technology is not a panacea, definitely. And the problem is that when you introduce technology, there are existing divides, like digital divides, poverty divides, gender divides, that the technology has to be sitting on top on. And what's really going on here is that in a lot of these Indian rural households, well, mothers actually give a lot of implicit permission to their sons to monopolize the cell phone and take it away from their daughters, even though the cell phones in that pilot were actually meant for the girls. Yeah, but unfortunately, the brother was always taking the cell phones away. So what the girls did eventually was to hide it near the kitchens where they worked so that the brothers couldn't come and take it. And the kitchen turned out to be the hottest place that really damaged some of the cell phone batteries. So one of the important lessons that we got out of this is that, okay, so when we try to do these kind of projects, it's very important to look into these kinds of issues like gender gaps. And that's actually why we have actually started a separate project now on gender empowerment, just really to understand how we could actually look into, well, basically, if you want these kind of projects to work, it's important to make sure that there's an appropriate social environment that is supportive about learning in home environments. So that's actually why we are looking into gender empowerments now. And we've conducted several interviews with non-government organizations that actually work in the area of gender equity and run various programs on that. Okay, but that's a separate presentation I'm not talking about today. So last thing I just want to mention is that, so we're in the process of trying to scale up the projects now. So, so one of the scale ups really would be a large scale evaluation. So we've had previous evaluations that I just talked about that demonstrate some of those learning benefits. But one of the most important impacts that we're trying to demonstrate is not just that children can learn this number of words using this technology. I mean, that itself is great, but what's really more compelling, if we really want to get this to be adopted and to get traction with so-called stakeholders in education, is to actually convince them that, that the games here can actually target an official government curriculum that parents, teachers, and other stakeholders view as an important credential for their children to be acquiring. And parents in India are very conscious about all these credentials because it is important to them. So we have to realize that all these interventions, again, take place within a broader political context. So right now, we're actually in the process of starting this pilot. So that would actually target one entire academic year of English curriculum where we have the contents developed. So one of the challenges in trying to do a large-scale pilot is that you need to do lots of contents development, okay? Because nobody's actually going to take this seriously if all we can do is simple vocabulary learning. So essentially what we're doing is we're going to be targeting the entire curriculum for 5th grade children in India. Well, we just had to pick one grade level. There are many reasons why we had to pick the 5th grade. I can talk about that more. Well, the short story is that one of the challenges in really trying to target an official curriculum is that even though a government body might say that we need to teach this stuff, and this is the official textbook, in practice it's very difficult when you are trying to do that in some remote village areas or some poor communities, because the challenge is that when government bodies create this curriculum, that kind of stuff actually is meant for middle income children. So when we talk about low-income children, there's a lot of all those kinds of prerequisite skills that we need to be targeting as well. So that's really one of those things that we've been doing a lot in the last 6 months, just developing that kind of content that would be a kind of a bridge curriculum that really targets all these remedial areas so that children would actually have that kind of foundation to be learning the official government curriculum. So we're talking about this problem where they are not even ready to learn the official curriculum and we need to get them up to it. So this is the stuff that we have already finished. So that's the first half of this. The total lesson plan that we have would actually target 100 days of curriculum. Right now we have already finished the first 50 of them and we are going to finish up the other 50. Okay, so with that, I think I'll just briefly conclude by just saying, okay, so in terms of scaling this out further, I think one of the challenges is not just to make this work in one specific state in India, which is what we've been doing so far, just based on the state's curriculum for Andhra Pradesh. But, different states in India have different government policies. Well, I'm not going to go into this too much, but the formal education system in the government for education, well, this is just part of the hierarchy. Very complicated. Short story is that, well, different states have different policies. So if you really want to have a kind of a mobile learning intervention that can work for different states, it's actually very important that, that we have a kind of a modular architecture that actually allows a lot of easy adaptation for local customization. There's a lot of details in this paper that I'm not going to get into, but I'll just say briefly that we actually borrow ideas from the community that's working on open educational resources to do some of this stuff. So and this is just my way of thanking a lot of our team members who've actually developed all this material with us and accompanied us on all the various field testing that we have done. So here's my contact information for people who are interested in getting in touch. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your nice presentation, Matthew. So right now we open the question and comments session. Are there some comments, questions over there first? Okay, and then. No, sorry.
So I was shocked, not by what you presented in the fading out of the novelty effect. I mean, not about the existence of a novelty effect, but about the huge impact that it really has. So it really goes up to 65 words in its maximum, and then drops down below 10. So my question, which is double, is: have you analyzed maybe not the reasons, because you might guess them, but have you analyzed the reasons, and are you doing something to enlarge the novelty effect or to smooth the drop?
Okay. Well, first, the thing with novelty effects is that it's something that you don't want to mess too much with, because we know there's novelty effects. So, okay, so maybe one way that I can phrase it is that you don't actually want. You need to be careful about trying to use a novelty effects to increase usage, because it's very hard to sustain novelty in the long term. And one way to sustain novelty, of course, is to keep introducing new content. Yeah, but that is very difficult if you know how expensive content development is. So that is actually why for the next stage, we are actually developing a set of games that actually aim to be more engaging. So during that study, I never had a professional game designer in the team. So we've hired a professional game designer in the last few months, starting from the summer, to actually develop those games that target this bridge curriculum. So hopefully with somebody who has more expertise in actually designing games, we can create learning experiences that are more engaging without having to rely on those kinds of novelty effects that are short-term.
Hi, Eva De Lera from WOC. First of all, thank you very much for sharing with us this great case study. My question is sort of follows that engagement, and also from a human-computer interaction perspective. I have noticed in the photographs that you've shared that the children were actually sharing, their mobile devices. Some of them, there are 4 children just watching at these. So we are talking about these smaller interfaces of mobile phones. And I understand and support, and we also develop for mobile phones. Mm-hmm. But I wonder, what's happening? This is the reality, but what's happening is that we're moving onto bigger interfaces all the time. And when you say we're doing good, but maybe not good enough, what do you think from an observational point? People sharing screens, maybe eyes, in these development communities, eyesight is not that great. Should we be also just food for thought? Should we be looking into maybe initiatives like the Hole in the Wall, Sugata Mitras, in which large screens can be shared by the community? Should we aim towards that and replicating more natural interfaces? Like you're trying to put the natural games into the mobile phones, but should we move a little bit toward bigger interfaces? And would that be better?
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, I think you asked several questions, and they seem to be very open-ended questions. So I'll give a shot at just some of them. Okay, so first, I don't think anybody is going to dispute that having a bigger screen is bad. Right? I think everybody would agree that the bigger the screen you have, the better. I think the issue is, can we actually afford to get larger screen cell phones to everybody? So some of the kinds of constraints that we're seeing right now on the ground is that you still can't do that. So even with that kind of phones that I've just shown you, a lot of this would still be quite out of reach for some of the poorest children. So in some sense, that is one of the constraints. So that is actually why we are still looking at using existing small screen displays for these communities who actually could benefit from having access to educational games on small scale, right? Anytime, anywhere. But now let's go on to the next part, which is big.
Because sorry to interrupt, I meant a large screen for others to share.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so that's a very different model actually, and I'm saying it's a different model because that's actually not mobile learning. You're talking about Hole in the Wall that actually uses say a typical computer monitor screen. We also have the Multiple Minds project that I think Emma mentioned yesterday morning. So so if you really do a comparison of that paradigm against the mobile learning paradigm, is quite different actually. And I'm saying it's different because I've also been involved in the Multiple Minds project, and I have a student, Derek Lomas, who's actually doing the Play Power project, if you guys are familiar with that. Okay, so that is a very different model because we are looking at large displays like televisions that can actually project a display that's large enough for a group of kids to crowd around. Okay, so that's obviously not mobile because you have something big. The nice thing about that is that you can get a display that can be be used by many children. I think one of the things that's understudied in that paradigm is that even if you can get one display to be shared by many children, not everybody is actually actively participating in that experience, in that collaborative learning experience at any one time. So one of the observations that we got out of PlayPower. So PlayPower is this project that tries to use this $10 gaming device, that you can connect to a large TV screen, so that you could actually use a lot of these existing low-end gaming devices for education. I mean, they already give you a way to play education games on it. It's programmable. One of the things that we found over the summer was that when kids actually got into those kinds of collaborative groups, so maybe one or two will be playing the game actively, there are some guys who are actually watching from the side and giving help here and there. So I think one of the interesting angles to think about for that paradigm is actually think about audience participation. Not typical audience participation from a television game show model, but in terms of what these guys actually do and how can we design these games to have a certain kind of subtext content that target the audience instead of the active player, and at the same time have that kind of subtext that would actually I think allow the audience to actually engage more actively in helping the active player. So I think there's a lot of that kind of things that could be done that hasn't been done. Okay, I think I've said enough.
Hello, I'm Carlos Fernandez from the Open University of Catalonia, the Office of Learning Technologies. First of all, I want to say that I really like your project, and the presentation was also very engaging, so congratulations. And then I have one question and like a couple of considerations. I'm going to start with the question. I would like to know about the learning outcomes in terms of castes, because in one of your graphs you were talking about the time that the different castes use the devices, but I would also like to know about the learning outcome, the final learning outcomes. And then the considerations, first of all, is that since, as you say, the performance of the battery was a key in the project, I would say, I think that the games that you proposed are really multimedia powered. And I was thinking that maybe that's not really necessary. I, for example, I'm a lover of all Nintendo games. I don't usually play to these new games that are very, very realistic. So why not to offer games that are less multimedia based, like, for example, quizzes or other kind of games? There's a lot of creativity in all games, so we can think about a lot of very different things, no? And secondly, I had the perception that most of the learners were playing individually. And well, I know a bit these small Indian communities also, and I know that they value the community and the interaction a lot. So I was thinking, why not engage through creating games that involve the whole community, involve some kind of interaction between the different learners? Because for Indians, this is really important, probably more important than for us Westerners, no?
Okay, so actually you've just asked 3 different questions, which was why I had to write them down before I forget. Okay, so I'll address your questions one at a time. So the first question about, I think the first question about caste was that, well, how well did the lower caste, well, what was the difference in learning outcomes across castes? I believe that was a question, if I have to paraphrase that, if I've understood that correctly. So I would just say that's a great question. I don't have the data for that right now, because with data from 18 participants, you can't do that kind of breakdown. So that's actually the question that we want to address using that large controlled study that we are doing, this one. Okay, so that's part of the question. So that's a great question. I think we are looking forward to finding that out. Email me maybe in a year's time and we hopefully have some data on that. Okay, second question about electricity and especially the fact that multimedia content is actually a huge source of power consumption on the cell phones. Yes, that's totally correct. So you suggested looking into ways in which we could actually cut down that kind of electricity usage. Okay, so actually, okay, again, the thing is that I don't have exact data to address that question, but I have some intuition. So if we go the route of having gaming content that might take the form of quizzes, for example. So that might work, it might not. But from what we've actually seen, well, it might actually work, okay? So, and that's actually one of the reasons why we've actually developed, so in the next batch of content that we've been developing, so for this one, we actually have more screens that are actually less game-like and just simple, just take the form of very simple quizzes. So hopefully that's one way to actually stretch the battery life on these cell phones. But there's another way to actually work around the electricity constraint also, and that is, well, okay, it might not be that easy, but I think one recommendation to anybody who is trying to sell cell phones in those places, you know, you can just easily include something like a hand crank power charger with all those cell phones. I think that's a very easy way to just get more of these cell phones being widely used in these developing regions if you don't have enough electricity in the grid system. Okay, the last question you had on individual games, okay, as in why don't we think about doing multiplayer games instead? Okay, so the short answer is that we've actually tried that. Yeah, you know, we used to think the way that you did also, as in, yeah, you know, in these kinds of village communities, there's a lot of social interactions and all that. But it's much more complicated than that, because when you try, you realize that, okay, first, okay, that was why, again, you know, when I first started talking about electricity, I was saying that as a Westerner, you used to come in thinking that, okay, all these village communities are fairly homogeneous. Well, they are not. There's a lot of underlying social tensions that go on also in terms of caste and all that. So, so if you want to do multiplayer gaming, you have to be careful about those kinds of social barriers before putting people together, because you know, people do fight when you put them together for various reasons that have already existed before you and I came into the picture. Okay, so assuming that we are sensitive towards those kinds of challenges, well, we can put them together. But another issue also is that collaborative learning is actually something that that learners actually need some training on in order to do properly. So what this means is that some of these basics like teamwork skills and all that are very important ingredients before you can have collaborative learning. And so for example, in school down here, you know, we probably had teachers that actually taught us some of these teamwork skills. But in some of those schools, the real challenge really is that you need to actually train students on how to learn collaboratively. And cooperative learning is actually one of those things that some of the teachers themselves are not very confident in doing in their classrooms. So I think this goes back to some of the broader issues that if we want to introduce some of these new paradigms, there's a lot of teacher training and other kinds of support that we need to look into before it becomes feasible. So, so we've tried multiplayer games. The short story was that the children were actually fighting among themselves. We had some more interesting results about how there were some kids who were actually messing up the teamwork dynamics. So they love to mess things up by telling this kid, hey, you know, that guy is doing better than you know, you need to hurry up. Okay, and sometimes that kind of side comments it's not really constructive when you're making students feel more anxious instead of giving them that kind of supportive environment that they should have in order to focus on learning rather than becoming competitive. Yeah, so cooperative learning is not easy to do. Okay, that's a short story.
Okay, thank you. You have 1, 2, 3 last questions. Sure.
Hi, Emma Kicillover, UNESCO. No, I already have my thing on. Does it work?
Yeah.
First, a comment and then a question. I think it's, thank you very much, Matt, for this presentation. I believe this is an amazing case of the project, which was carefully planned and studied, and methodology of the research a lot, thought a lot. Look, actually, we are coming along the lines, so many specific different angles. We are talking engagement time factor. We are talking social class issue, gender biases and gender issues. And the most kind of interesting for me personally was that you are trying to understand the learning pattern of the people before you start designing your game. And I understand that this kind of a cognitive map, which you were doing before, when you are going into different regions, like say you go to China, whatever, could you elaborate a little bit on how different and how important these learning patterns are while going into the native community with a very specific mentality and learning ways?
Okay, well, I'm not sure if I can actually give you a good answer to that, because that is one of the big questions in our field, and maybe John can have better answers. I think what I'm just going to say is, you know, you've just touched on one of those huge debates about, well, for all this learning, how much of that actually is biological and how much of that is cultural, right? You know, which of the two actually influence learning more? And that's a huge debate right now. But the way I would look at this is, well, if you look at a lot of the previous research in say, literacy studies, especially from researchers who don't just come in from a cognitivist or information processing standpoint, but also look at this from a social cultural standpoint. So we find that there's actually a certain level of influence that culture actually plays in all these learning processes. I think the challenge is, how do we actually operationalize this in a way that you can actually study, because a lot of existing socio-cultural ways of thinking about learning, you know, it's not exactly deterministic and framed in a way that is even attempting to look at generalization beyond individual settings. So that's actually the part that I'm stumped at, you know, and I think John is smiling away now because he probably knows how hard it is. So yeah, the short answer is, I think I empathize a lot with the question you're asking, but I don't think I have a good answer for that. Yeah, but that would be the starting point for how I would think about framing this.
Yes, thanks. I can't begin to address all that stuff you were unpacking there, but you were making me think of a rather simpler way of looking at it. I've been reading some work from Nokia in Bangalore, working with a slate metaphor, and using that metaphor and using some user-centered design methods and some participative design methods. And it was raising the question in my mind that the nearer you get to participative design in some communities, the further you get from progressive ideas about education. I mean, that's come up in my mind in Kenya, where local, informal and community ideas about education, what education is, what learning consists of, would make our toes curl up. And so there's a kind of tension. Do you work with what seems to be kind of traditional, that's a nice word, conservative, that's a reasonably nice word, or do you, as it were, impose something more progressive around, you know, social constructivism, whatever it is we do in the developed world? Or is there do you just go with a kind of pragmatic, you know, working with the context you're in?
Yeah, it's interesting that you actually ran into the same kind of tension that I had, because when I first started this, and when I first started this project, I was thinking of constructivism and worse, constructionism. So that's the okay, this is going to open up some can of worms. Well, that's basically the approach that the OLPC guys take. Okay, so we tried that. At least in a short pilot of 2 weeks, we found that it was really hard to get that approach to work. If you have more time, maybe. So I think that part of what we learned on the ground was that, okay, if you try to use some of these fancy approaches that I think are highly advocated for in an industrialized world setting, well, it wouldn't even fly in some developing regions. And part of that is that, you know, if we look at some of the needs down there in terms of education needs, so in order to really target some of these higher order thinking skills and other kinds of competencies, you first need to actually have the lower level skills nailed down in terms of fluency and automaticity in those kinds of basic skills. Otherwise, you don't actually have enough of a foundation for higher order skills to actually use. So that's one explanation that's been advanced by some of us on why we need to go back to some of a more old school approach to doing this. So you find that in my list of competencies here, we don't actually have a lot of those very advanced and open-ended kinds of things on the lines of constructivism, even though a lot of the learning sciences literature actually advocate a lot of that. I think that kind of stuff is great if you are trying to, and we want to integrate some of that in terms of focus on meaning in literacy, so that students learn all this stuff about, vocabulary and alphabets, not just in terms of the form of the language, but also in terms of meaning and engaging with meaning. But to actually have them construct, well, I think that's going to take one more step further. We found that it's really difficult, partly because a lot of the existing school-based exercises are so rote-based that if you want to start by getting them to think out of that box, well, it needs to start with the teacher first. So again, this is why sometimes I keep getting back to teacher training.
Sorry, just the last intervention over there, please. Thank you.
Oh, Steve.
Okay. Matt, a wonderful project. Congratulations. Yeah. One question. Do you think that when you go from your kind of game-based approach so far, more into this kind of school approach, do you think that's going to turn off some of the kids as it becomes more, it starts to smell more like school than fun? Yeah.
Okay, I actually have an answer for that because, I didn't go into those kinds of subtleties here, but one of the things we found in our pilots in 2007 was that you actually cannot design games that are too game-like for these kids. Okay, let me explain why. So one of the issues was that when we first had so when we first came in, I think we did a project in a way that was very extreme because we didn't really have a good sense of the whole design space. We were doing games that had a lot of interesting and fanciful graphics for teaching vocabulary. The problem with that was that when the kids saw all those fanciful graphics and animations, they paid attention to the animations. They didn't realize that was actually meant to be educational. Okay, so when we realized that this was the kind of impression that the game screens were doing, because it doesn't really match their understanding of what learning is. To them, learning means, there's a school and there's a teacher and there's a blackboard. So we changed that design, replaced it with a screen that had a blackboard, some stuff that were being taught on the blackboard, and a face of their teacher. Okay, so we put the teacher into that screen. Wow, the kids started to pay attention to that screen, even though it was more boring than a game, because they realized right away that that was a cue for them to pay attention. This is learning. You need to focus. So what we did eventually was that we only had games for the kids to test their knowledge on. Yeah, we didn't have games for teaching because that is just a kind of a difference again in their cultural expectation about what learning is.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting intervention. So we just congratulate you.
Okay, thanks a lot for the attention.